Industry Voice, Forcing Efficiency, How Energy Shocks Rewrite the Automotive Rulebook. Energy shocks have always accelerated automotive change, not because they persuade, but because they force. The war involving Iran is now producing that same kind of pressure. As tensions disrupt flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor central to global oil supply, energy markets have responded immediately. In early April, U.S. gasoline prices crossed $4 per gallon for the first time since 2022, and it happened quickly. That number matters less as a headline than as a threshold. When fuel prices cross certain points, consumer behavior changes in ways that are both predictable and well documented. Households do not respond to oil shocks by reassessing their values. They respond by reassessing their budgets. This is not a new dynamic. During the 1970s oil shocks, American drivers did not gradually come to prefer fuel efficiency. They were forced into it. As oil prices rose and supply tightened, demand shifted towards smaller, more efficient vehicles. Empirical research has consistently shown that higher gasoline prices alter vehicle purchasing decisions, accelerating the adoption of efficiency when the cost difference becomes material. The mechanism was straightforward. Economics overrode preference. That mechanism is reasserting itself now, but the system it is acting on is different. In the 1970s, the only available response was incremental. Better mileage, smaller cars, marginal gains in efficiency. Today, there is an alternative that did not exist at scale then. Electrification is no longer a technical experiment. It is approaching economic viability at the same time that fuel costs are becoming less predictable. Subsequent U.S. clean energy laws in the 1980s and 1990s, brought about as part of the corporate average fuel economy CAFE standards, classified SUVs as light trucks, which made them subject to looser fuel efficiency rules. Automakers exploited this loophole, ramping up SUV production and marketing them aggressively. Sales surged. SUV sales went from 1% of vehicles sold in America in 1980 to over 25% by 2000. Yet demand for early EVs, like GM's EV1, remained robust among consumers. Thousands leased despite limited rollout, as interest in efficiency persisted, even as automakers deprioritized development amid SUV profits. Battery prices have fallen sharply over the past decade, reaching levels that make mass-market electric vehicles feasible. At the same time, gasoline has reintroduced volatility into the cost of operating internal combustion vehicles. This combination matters more than any individual policy incentive. When EVs approach price parity, the decision is no longer abstract. Consumers compare total cost of ownership and exposure to future price swings. In that comparison, volatility becomes as important as price. The disruption tied to Iran is not simply raising fuel costs, it is reintroducing uncertainty into them. Oil markets are structurally exposed to geopolitical risk, and the Strait of Hormuz is a persistent vulnerability within that system. When that vulnerability becomes active, the effect is transmitted directly to consumers. They may not follow shipping data or diplomatic developments, but they experience the outcome every time they fill their tank. Electricity operates under a different set of constraints. It is locally generated, regulated, and comparatively stable. That does not make it immune to price changes, but it does insulate it from the kind of geopolitical exposure that defines oil markets. For consumers, that distinction is increasingly material. The appeal of electrification is not reducible to environmental preference. It's also a function of risk management. For much of the past decade, the EV industry has treated infrastructure as the primary barrier to adoption. The assumption has been that more chargers deployed more quickly would unlock demand. That assumption has always been incomplete. Infrastructure expands in response to usage, not in anticipation of it. This pattern holds across sectors. Highways followed car ownership. Broadband followed computing demand. What the current price shock is doing is accelerating demand-side pressure. More consumers are entering the market for alternatives because the cost of remaining with internal combustion has become less predictable. But this acceleration is exposing a different bottleneck. The constraint has moved upstream. Electrification changes how energy is consumed. Instead of distributing fuel through an existing logistics network, it concentrates demand on the electrical grid. That demand is not only greater in aggregate, it is more concentrated in time and location. Fast charging, in particular, creates high power loads that local infrastructure was not designed to support. Analyses from the International Energy Agency and the U.S. Department of Energy make clear that unmanaged charging at scale can strain distribution systems, requiring upgrades to transformers, feeders, and interconnection capacity. These are not marginal adjustments. They introduce real constraints on how quickly and where charging infrastructure can be deployed. The result is that the transition will not proceed evenly. Rising fuel prices may accelerate consumer interest, but infrastructure will expand only where the underlying system can support it. Some regions will scale quickly, particularly where grid capacity is already robust. Others will lag, not because demand is absent, but because deployment is constrained by cost and capacity. This is not a failure of policy or planning. It is the expected outcome of a system operating under new conditions. As constraints shift, so does value. In the traditional automotive model, value accrued primarily at the level of the vehicle, its design, its manufacturing, its brand. Electrification redistributes that value toward the systems that enable vehicles to function. The question is no longer only what consumers want to buy, it is also what the energy system can accommodate. That shift changes where competitive advantage lies. It is no longer sufficient to build a better car. The relevant question is whether that car can be supported by infrastructure that is economically and physically viable to deploy. The war involving Iran has made one aspect of this transition unusually clear. Energy markets remain exposed to geopolitical risk, and that risk can reprice consumer behavior quickly. The effect is not ideological, it is financial. The pattern is consistent with history. Energy shocks accelerate change by forcing economic decisions. What is different now is that the constraint is no longer confined to the vehicle. It sits with the system. This industry voice comes from Atish Patel, the president of XCharge North America, overseeing U.S. operations. He previously held roles at Desktop Metal and Deloitte. Patel holds a BS in mechanical engineering from NYU and a master's in management from Harvard.